Welcome back. Thank you for being on time. I appreciate that. And of course, it's always important because the gentleman right here, he's quite cosmic, and indeed, time has a lot to do with what we're going to be talking about tonight. With a gentleman who I have learned a lot from over the years. I've had the wonderful opportunity on many occasions to travel with him and to introduce him at various lectures and talks, and this is just another one of those very special occasions right here at Cosmic Summit 2025. Dr. Robert M. Schoch is a geologist, geophysicist, a historian of ancient civilizations whose groundbreaking research has redefined our understanding of humanity's distant past. He's best known for his, at times controversial, also well-supported dating of the Great Sphinx to circa 10,000 BCE. And Dr. Schoch has also expanded his work to include exploration at sites like Gobekli Tepe, which we've heard about, and so much more. His interdisciplinary approach blends geology, archaeology, and ancient mythology, and tonight he brings to the Cosmic Summit his exploration of lost civilizations and cosmic influences on human history. And so I'll ask you, please, bring the volume down ever so slightly. Shh. And I want you to, there you go. Zone in, tune in, and turn on, because you're about to hear all about a cycle of civilization prior to the end of the last ice age. Please join me in making welcome Dr. Robert Schoch. Go get him, Tiger.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really appreciate being here. Is this sounding good? Okay, because I've been, my hearing's been bothering me. But yeah, I really appreciate being here. I don't know if he's here, but I want to thank George Howard for inviting me back this year. I first was at Cosmic Summit last year, and I really appreciate being back. I have been speaking to people during the conference so far and trying to get a feel for things. And what I mean by that is that I find there are people who are repeats, but there are a number of new people here, including people who have never heard me speak before. So I want to say right now that I'm going to talk for 2 hours, hopefully fit in 2 hours. And what I will do is I will begin with some of my foundational work. So those who have heard me speak before, this will not be new to you, but hopefully you'll pick up something new. And then after that, I will develop things further. I'll go through some more information and some other developments, etc. So it's going to be a combination of, if you've heard me speak before, maybe things you've heard, maybe you haven't. And I do have a situation where I remember once, and just one quick story now, where I was speaking at a conference, and someone I know well, she'd heard me speak 6 or 7 times before, and she said, well, why didn't you talk about X, Y, and Z, certain things? I said, well, you've heard me talk about that half a dozen times. Oh, but I'd like to hear it again. So bear with me. Don't walk out on me if you say, oh, you've heard this before, because you're going to hear some new things also. So with that in mind, I want to point out that, yes, foundationally, okay, my computer's telling me I should give it subtitles or something. AI. I don't want AI. But you don't see that on the screen. Okay, so foundationally, I have been doing this for 35, actually, plus years, because to give credit where credit's due, you may have heard of the late John Anthony West. He first invited me to Egypt to study the Sphinx as a geologist. My PhD is geology and geophysics, and he had heard from, or had read and was working on the massive tomes of Shuar de Lubitsch. Not to go into him now, but he was an Egyptologist and really an all-round scholar who first suggested in one sentence that maybe the Sphinx went back before the Sahara Desert. So I got involved first, going to Egypt in 1990. That was my first trip to Egypt. I've been there more times than I can remember now. And at that time, the standard dogma was that Civilization only went back to about 3500 BC. The Sphinx was carved in about 2500 BC. The Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau outside of Cairo. It's on the edge of the Sahara Desert. It's carved into the limestone bedrock, just to give you a little foundation. And it sits largely below ground. And I realized very, very quickly on my first trip there that there is something amiss with the standard dating of the Sphinx. 2500 BCE for the Sphinx, 4,500 years does not cut it because, in fact, the Sahara Desert is older than that. And what you see on the Sphinx is weathering that's not compatible with the Sahara Desert. I also want to point out, and I'll come back to that point, that when they carved the Sphinx, it was a real triumph of engineering, if you would. A lot of people don't realize this or don't think about it. They did not just chip away the rock to free the body of the Sphinx. They actually carved it into multi-ton blocks, some of which weigh 50 or maybe up to 100 tons, and they moved them to construct what are now known as the Sphinx and Valley Temple. This is the Sphinx Temple with the Valley Temple off to the left, and you can see some people for scale. So these structures are as old as the original core body of the Sphinx. And there you can see another picture of it. The Sphinx sits due east of the second pyramid. That's a so-called Khafra pyramid in the background. And what I found on that first trip there was that the core body of the Sphinx and the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, again, they had to carve down into the bedrock, is eroded by water. It's weathered and eroded by water. This is incompatible with the hyper-arid climate, and it's not just that it was water, it had to be protracted rains. It was not water, for instance, rising up from the Nile. It was protracted rains. It was water runoff from the rest of the plateau, and this is evident both in what I call the rolling, undulating profile, and the deep vertical fissures that you see in the rock. The person in the bottom right, that's younger me when I was first studying it. And here I am with John Anthony West, younger me, and as I said, this is not due to Nile flooding. Some of my critics have said, oh, well, it's now Nile flooding. Yeah, right. The Nile does not flood up to the head of the Sphinx, number one. And number two, it would not produce these types of erosional features. That's just basic geology 101. And the Sahara Desert has been a desert for some 5,000 plus years. So the logical conclusion I came to is that you look at the different erosional features, you look at the rain erosion, and this diagram shows the difference between rain erosion and what you get with wind erosion in a Sahara-type desert condition. Also, the rock layers are composed of harder and softer layers, sort of like a layer cake. So in both cases, you take out the softer layers first, but it's very different. Wind weathering, younger me looking at wind weathering. We have wind weathering and wind erosion on well-dated tombs. These are just a few hundred meters away from the Sphinx itself, and these have been dated very specifically, very accurately by Egyptologists to the Fourth Dynasty, to approximately the same time that the Sphinx was supposedly carved. This is impossible that this weathering and erosion and the Sphinx weathering and erosion are contemporaneous. Here we have more wind tunnel, angular tunnel weathering features, and you can compare that to the rounded undulating profile, the rain profile. That is me standing in one of the fissures. I'm just there for scale to show you how extreme this weathering is. This is not something that occurs just in a few decades, as some of the Egyptologists have tried to claim, oh, it's modern weathering. No, that's not the case. It doesn't even occur in just a few centuries. We're talking millennia. So that was a first clue to me that we have to date the core body of the Sphinx back to an earlier period, pre-Saharan condition period. I estimated initially 5 to 7,000 BCE as a minimal date for the core body of the Sphinx, but in fact, evidence now indicates that goes back much further. So something that we did very early on, and I wanted subsurface data, is that we did subsurface seismic testing. Basically, we used a hammer on a steel plate. I did this with my colleague, Thomas Dobecki, who is the person seated in the photograph that you're looking at. John Anthony West is actually standing behind him. And what we did is we put sound waves or energy waves into the rock. It bounces around, to put it very crudely, and we picked up subsurface evidence of weathering around the Sphinx. Now, as the rock is exposed, it begins to weather. You still have rock there. It's still very hard from a human perspective, but it has mineralogical changes, and this correlates with age. The depth correlates with age, so this allowed me to calibrate things and confirm ultimately that we're talking about 10,000 BCE approximately for the core body of the Sphinx. Something that I found, and I was already suspicious of this on the surface, is that the rump was not fully carved out originally. When they did repairs thousands of years later, around 2500 BCE, yes, the date of 2500 BCE is appropriate to the Sphinx, but not for its origins, but for its repairs, its refurbishing. At that point, they carved out the rump. So essentially, the work both on the surface, and there's other lines of evidence I won't go into detail now. If you want to know all about the Sphinx and the evidence I'm using, I'm not pushing books here, but I'm telling you where you can get the information. You can look at Origins of the Sphinx, which I wrote with my colleague Robert Bouval, and I also talk about this in Forgotten Civilization. If you pick up that book, you want the second edition, the new revised edition. But all of the evidence pushed it ultimately back to about 10,000 BCE. And this is a significant time period because this is the end of the last ice age. This is just before the close of the last ice age, and I'll come back to that. Something that I also noticed literally within the first 90 seconds of my first trip to Egypt in the summer of 1990 is that the head of the Sphinx currently is out of proportion to the body. And this made, honestly, perfect sense to me when I put it together with the erosional features on the Sphinx. The head is not eroded to any great extent, and what erosion it does show is due to wind. So that's Sahara Desert. What happened? The head originally was much larger. It was heavily eroded. It was heavily weathered. And I am 100% convinced that the early dynastic Egyptians, when I say early dynastic, literally early dynastic or maybe early Fourth Kingdom, but certainly by 2500 BCE, they had recarved the head. When you recarve a weathered earlier head, what happens to it? It gets smaller. So it's too small for the body. Initially, I was thinking it was a lion, and I was thinking of male lion. We now realize that it was actually originally a female lion, and this is referred to in some of the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions that date back to 3000 or 3100 BCE, so 500 to 600 years earlier than supposedly the Sphinx was ever thought about by the dynastic Egyptians. All the pieces are coming together. The Sphinx goes back to a much earlier period. And the female lion, or lioness, was actually a form of the goddess Mehit, or Mehit, who guarded archives, who guarded records. And this all makes sense because another discovery we found Thomas Dobecki and I, when we did the seismic work, is that we found a chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx. So under the left paw of the Sphinx, if you look at this map, this is a tomographic map based on the seismic data. You can see the outline of the Sphinx. You're looking down on the Sphinx. Everyone sees that. And under the left paw is what we called anomaly A. That's a chamber under the left paw. No question about it in my mind. There is a chamber there, and this has been suggested as an archive or a hall of records. Edgar Cayce even predicted that that would occur, that would be found, which was very embarrassing to me as an academic because I didn't know anything about Edgar Cayce. But the bottom line is there's a chamber there. This ties in with the ancient traditions of the Egyptians, that Mehit, or the lioness, was guarding a chamber, guarding an archive that would hold records. I dearly would like to get into that chamber, and that's something I'm still working on after all these decades, but modern Egyptian politics is complicated. So my first dating, my initial dating of the Sphinx, drove it back several thousand years. Initially, I was not thinking end of the last ice age. Now, based on all the data, I know that's end of the last ice age. But even a few thousand years older drove the Egyptologists and the historians crazy. And I mean that they were attacking me, calling me names, et cetera, et cetera. I first addressed this. I first presented this after submitting refereed abstracts and papers to the Geological Society of America. Without exception, all the straight geologists, when I say straight, pure geologists, all the pure geologists, if I could put it that way, accepted my work. In fact, a few of them, because I was talking initially 5,000 to 7,000 BCE, the only criticism I got initially was that I had possibly underestimated the age of the Sphinx, not overestimated how old it is. Am I making sense? They actually saw the data and said, no, it could be a few thousand years earlier, at least, than you're talking about. So that's the criticism I got from the pure geologists. In fairness, there were a couple, quote, geoarchaeologists who worked for Egyptologists who were, how should I say it, required to say that I was wrong and try to figure out why. I won't go into all the crazy theories, but camels urinating on the plateau and the water running down from, them, it does not weather the Sphinx the way it is. I mean, that was literally suggested to me. I don't know if it was a joke or not. So the Egyptologists and historians were so upset that they actually organized in 1992 a debate at the American Association for the Advancement of Science to basically put me in my place and to deny that the Sphinx is older than the traditional view. Mark Lehner, who I could tell you many stories about, but I won't. He did work for the ARE, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, for a while, and then turned and went 180 degrees out of the way and became a very conventional Egyptologist, and did his dissertation at Yale on the Sphinx, of all things. I did my dissertation and PhD work at Yale also, but I was not in Egyptology. I was in geology and geophysics. So it was interesting to, how should I say, have our discussions, which just went past each other because he didn't want to hear the data. He just knew I was wrong and basically said that. And a quote from him is, if the Sphinx was built by an earlier culture, where is the evidence of that civilization? Where are the pottery shards? People during that age were hunters and gatherers. Everyone knows about hunters and gatherers. They're supposed to be stupid and primitive by conventional academic standards. I don't believe that for a second. They didn't build cities. That is, they didn't have civilization. And he basically asked, where do you find other evidence of advanced people going back 12,000 years? In 1992, this was 1992, I did not have other evidence for that. Then comes on the scene a few years later. Unfortunately, he's now deceased, but the late Hair Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt began excavating at Göbekli Tepe. Now, Göbekli Tepe had been known, but it wasn't known what the site was. In fact, some people thought it was just a Greco-Roman or Byzantine site. He began excavating it, and again, the timing is important. He starts doing this about 1995. That's several years after the infamous debate. I wish I'd had that data at that time, because what he found excavating Göbekli Tepe is what he initially referred to as major building phases of incredible sophistication, going back, his initial dates were 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. This is what I have been referring to as Sphinx-age, that yes, there were civilized, highly cultured, sophisticated people at that time. Göbekli Tepe is in southeastern Turkey, near the city of Urfa, Şanlıurfa, which is, interestingly, the traditional home, according to at least people in modern Turkey, of Abraham, the patriarch of the Judeo-Christian, Muslim, Abrahamic traditions. Someone who I've gotten to meet and discuss things with is Ian Hodder, who was at Stanford for many years, many decades before he retired, one of the deans, one of the great archaeologists of Turkey. He excavated a number of sites in his career in modern Turkey, and he had to say, when Göbekli Tepe was discovered, and the implications of it are that it's unbelievably big and amazing at a ridiculously early date. Huge, great stones and fantastic, highly refined art. Many people think that it changes everything. Here's the important point. It overturns the whole apple cart. All our theories were wrong. And I think that is so good for him as a standard conventional academic to admit that Göbekli Tepe really changes how we have to think about early civilization. So it's an incredible site. It has these huge megalithic stone circles. Close to 24 have now been not excavated, but recovered. I shouldn't say recovered, been found using various geophysical methods. Several have been excavated, about 5 have been excavated. And when you look at it from the air, it has these ring-type features. So think of Stonehenge and other henges, which are ring-type features, but Göbekli Tepe shares that characteristic. But the stones, unlike Stonehenge, I love Stonehenge, but Stonehenge and structures like that are these big, crude, rough blocks. Göbekli Tepe, and here I am in May 2010, and you can see one of the rings behind me, known as Enclosure C. Göbekli Tepe is beautifully carved limestone pillars with reliefs on them. There's carvings that go with it. So it's an incredible structure. It's a UNESCO structure now, or it's a UNESCO heritage site, and they put an awning over it. I'm just going to flip through some slides just to give you a sense of Göbekli Tepe. These are from different times that Katie, my wife, and I have visited. So sometimes with the awning, without the awning. We've seen it a number of times. But you get these beautiful T-shaped pillars. These are pillars carved from limestone, and each pillar is a solid block of limestone. Beautifully carved with carvings on them. This one, if you look at it on the right, you can see that's an arm. So they're anthropomorphic. Some of them are anthropomorphic with an arm and a hand and a little animal under its belt. Here, this is known as Enclosure C. And notice the, again, relief carving, the bas relief carving. And this is sometimes known as the beast. This is a beautiful animal, in my opinion, that is carved into it. It's not attached to it. They planned this. This is all one piece. This is part of the pillar. This is incredibly sophisticated for being 12,000 years old. Archaeologists off the record who I've questioned about have suggested, well, if they just found it in isolation, it might be 600 BC by their estimate, or maybe 1,000 BC or BCE by their estimate, not 12,000 years ago, not approximately 10,000 BCE. So it's really out of place. This is sometimes known as a vulture pillar. I won't try to get into interpretations of it now. Some of the other pillars with extinct aurochs possibly on it, etc. So some of these animals may actually be extinct animals that go back to the end of the last ice age, which is incredible. The dating on this site, I want to say, is really good. It's really well controlled. Here's another, just to give you a sense of these pillars. Another picture. It is very well controlled. It's in north. When I say well controlled, the dating is very well controlled because we have good stratigraphic data. We have radiocarbon data on various plasters that were used at one point, and various fibers, various other isotopes that go back actually to the end of the Younger Dryas as the end of the last ice age. The site itself is in northern Mesopotamia, which is sometimes referred to as the biblical Eden. Because when you read the Judeo-Christian Bible, it talks about the Tigris and Euphrates and where Eden is relative to those rivers, and some people would place it in northern Mesopotamia. I'm not saying the Garden of Eden necessarily, but the general area, which I think is interesting. And as I said, the initial dating for Göbekli Tepe, according to Klaus Schmidt, was even earlier than my initial dating for the origins of the Sphinx. Something else that's been found, and he's one of my favorites, maybe my favorite statue from antiquity, is known as Urfa Man. He was found in the city of Urfa, Shanli-Urfa, which Göbekli Tepe is maybe a half-hour drive from Urfa itself. And when they do construction projects, when they do, new housing or urban development, etc., they often find archaeological antiquities and archaeological sites, including the strata, including going back to Göbekli Tepe time. So this is how Urfa Man was found. On the left, he is in his new abode in the modern museum. On the right, that's him with me for scale when in the old museum. I had a chance to discuss things with the late Professor Klaus Schmidt when we were there. That's me and Schmidt discussing things. That's John Anthony West in the foreground. And he assured me, because I went there very skeptical, even though I'd love something to fit my working hypothesis, I'm always skeptical about new data. So I wanted to know this really goes back 12,000 years. And he convinced me, and I've, of course, read all the papers and technical literature ever since, that yes, there's really good controls, I mentioned, on the dating, stratigraphic control. There's mineral deposits that were formed that can be dated because the entire site was intentionally buried. I'll come back to that. And then basically little stalactites, little stalagmites form in the deposits once it was buried, and those can be dated. The pillars themselves are absolutely incredible. They're ornately carved, as I mentioned. You can see one of them here. This is enclosure D, one of the most famous pillars, and it has arms and a belt, et cetera, and a loincloth, and they were set in a form of concrete, so incredibly sophisticated. And here you can see how they have the hands towards the navel. And this is a theme that we see around the world. I'll come back to that briefly later. You've got the foxbelt loincloth. And something else I want to mention, and this is very radical, so please don't hold it against me, because I'm an academic, but this is supposed to be not only pre-pottery, quote, Neolithic, but certainly well before the use of any kind of metallurgy. That's the classical point of view. Yet, what you find at Göbekli Tepe, which I think is of equal sophistication, is not just the huge pillars beautifully carved and other sculptures beautifully carved, but you also find little tiny objects. So one thing that you see on the right that is not my hand, the hand on the far right, can you see what it's holding? That's a little, quote, arrowhead. Looks very primitive. Oh, that's fine with the historians and the conventional archaeologists. Yes, they were just primitive hunter-gatherers. They made little flint arrowheads. And that somehow is to prove that they were primitive. Well, I will tell you that I'm using PowerPoint now. I teach at Boston University. Unlike some faculty members, if I lose the PowerPoint, if the technology goes down, I don't dismiss my students. I use a chalk and blackboard, which people have been using for hundreds of years. Do you get my point? You can have primitive, quote, primitive technology even in a more sophisticated society. So I don't care if they were using little arrowheads. Look at the middle and left-hand picture. That is my hand, and what I am holding in my hand is a little teeny, really hard stone bead that is drilled lengthwise at a sub-millimeter level with a hole through it so that it can be threaded or whatnot. How do you do this without metal tools? How do you do this with very primitive tools? They have found literally thousands of these beads. They're incredibly sophisticated, very micro level, if you would. And I would contend, and I've become more and more adamant about this, I suspect that they were actually using metal to do this. I suspect, this is my working hypothesis after talking to metallurgists and reading a lot of literature about, that they may have had iron. They may have been known how to take basic iron ores and heat them and beat them and smelt them to make wrought iron. If you know anything about iron, I'm not suggesting cast iron, that's different, but wrought iron. And if you had little wrought iron tools, say little needles or knives, that type of thing, 12,000 years later, would you expect to find them? No, the answer is supposed to be no. You might just by chance, but unlikely, because what does iron do? It rusts, number one, and number two, how many of you are going to, how many have, I don't know, I was going to say, how many are carrying a sheath knife or something with you right now? You don't need to tell me, but if you do, what you should do is leave it on the table when you leave, and everyone should leave it there untouched so that archaeologists in 12,000 years can find it. Do you get my point? They wouldn't be leaving these things around, but if they drop one and it was covered over and buried for archaeologists to find, what would the archaeologists find? The clue is there, a little line of rust. The most insignificant, very subtle. Are the archaeologists looking for this? No. And even if they were looking for it and expecting it, it would be so subtle. I tell you as a geologist, I know about these things. It would be so subtle, it would be virtually impossible to find, and it's really impossible if you're not looking for it. Am I making sense? So I think they may have had actually metal. Anyway, I am convinced that they had all the sophisticated attributes that you need to recognize true civilization. They certainly had monumental stone architecture. This is how standard archaeologists, and I have a degree in anthropology with a specialty in archaeology on top of my PhD in geology and geophysics. You look for stone architecture on a monumental scale. You look for urban city life. Some of the critics say, well, Göbekli Tepe, they weren't living there. Well, maybe they weren't living there. Maybe they were. That's actually an open question. But I can tell you where some of them were living. They were living in what is now the modern city of Urfa. Remember? That city goes back at least 12,000 years. I think it's one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. And then you have to be literate to be, quote, civilized, according to the conventional story. And were the Göbekli Tepe people literate? Here's another radical suggestion. Yes, that they were. When you look at the Göbekli Tepe pillars and other artifacts, there are consistent symbols that occur over and over again. Something that my colleague, Dr. Manu Seyfzadeh, first suggested, and then we looked at it and worked on it, is that these symbols are not just decoration. They're true symbols. They're basically writing, a very early form of writing, probably the earliest form of writing we may know, although some people have argued that some of the symbols used in European caves and whatnot were effectively, even an earlier form of writing. But the concept of writing does not go back, in my assessment, just 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. I think that we have good evidence for it at Göbekli Tepe. So this is part of that belt on one of the pillars. And when you start comparing this to what are known Anatolian, or sometimes they're referred to as Hittite or Luwian hieroglyphs from Turkey, so from an area very close to Göbekli Tepe, yes, those Hittite or Luwian or Anatolian hieroglyphs are thousands of years later, but some of them sure look very similar to what we have at Göbekli Tepe, and I think there could be a temporal continuity between them and a cultural continuity. So, for instance, we have this symbol that looks like a C and then a couple of pillars in a backward C. That's known to represent God. Compare that to what we have on the Göbekli Tepe pillar. Do they look somewhat similar? Yes, even though they're separated by thousands of years, you start looking at other symbols. These are called LaRoche symbols, after Professor LaRoche, who studied these back in the 20th century. And we have very good understanding of what they refer to in Hittite or Luwian or Anatolian society, so referring to the divine. 239, which looks like an H, refers to a gateway or a portal or a passage. 360, number 360 literally is God. What looks like a C to us refers to connection to God or gods. So you start looking at this. This is my reading of the belt on this particular pillar, reading from left. I always have to get this correct. Reading from right to left. Reading from right to left. I think they were reading right to left. Do some languages still read right to left? Yeah, name some. Yeah, Hebrew, Arabic, right? Am I correct? Yeah. So I think they're reading right to left, and my interpretation is that this says literally God of gods, and that they were literate. Here, do you see this on the Göbekli Tepe pillar, another pillar? That this is a pathway or portal to God. It's actually also a solar plasma configuration, but we'll come back to that. So civilization existed, I have no doubt, at the end of the last ice age, and it was followed by catastrophe. The Göbekli Tepe people, and Klaus Schmidt talked about this in his published works and also in verbal conversations. It's really strange, he thought, and other people thought too, that you had these sophisticated people before the end of the last ice age, and then a few hundred years later, they disappear. They're not there. You don't find them in the archaeological records. Something happened, and what that something is the end of the last ice age. Göbekli Tepe itself shows evidence of being catastrophically disturbed. You have broken pillars. They were then hastily re-erected by the ancient people. Then the whole site was intentionally buried. And if you look at this, you can you see in the pillar on the left? to the left pillar, do you see how it actually fell over and then was hastily re-erected, and these crude stone walls were put between the pillars to basically hold them in place? Look at the pillar in the foreground. Do you see how it's broken? It was put back together. That's not the archaeologists doing that. This was done by the ancient people. Look at this. This is one of the pillars. They're beautifully carved, but it's got this secondary stone wall basically up against the carving. And then if you look at this, look at the pillar in sort of the central, slightly to the left background, and you can see there you have a closer view of it. The pillar was re-erected. The top was put in position using slabs of other pillars. This was basically being destroyed and re-erected. What is going on? And it was packed, as we call it, for posterity. Just as a side note, Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, will be speaking tomorrow morning, and she will talk more about intentional burial and hypothesis that much of Egypt actually was intentionally buried. That goes back to an earlier period, was intentionally buried, then reused by the dynastic Egyptians, just as I've explained, or just as I've talked about, that the Sphinx, what we now know as the Sphinx, is actually an older structure that was reappropriated, reused. So we seem to have other structures in Egypt, but this ties in with the intentional burial at Göbekli Tepe. Now, at Göbekli Tepe, it was intentionally buried, but they never came back and uncovered it. No one ever came back and reused it until the 1990s. So in ancient times, it was left, and it was basically forgotten about, more or less, forgotten about. So why was it buried? What was going on? This brings us to the end of the last ice age. And there was a cold snap. The ice age was beginning to warm up. It was beginning to warm up. You can see on this chart, which is not to scale. It's a logarithmic chart, basically a crude logarithmic chart from environmental science textbooks I'm a co-author on. And you can see on the far left, it was very cold. It started to warm up, but then there's a cold snap. And that cold snap is known as the Younger Dryas. You've heard about that, I'm sure. And that cold snap, by my dating, when I say my dating, standard geological dating now, although you'll hear other dates a century or two off, is about 10,900 BC to 9,700 BCE. So that's a cold snap at the end of the last ice age. I'm not going to talk today about the beginning of the Younger Dryas, although I do think that was caused by a solar event, and I can explain that to people if they want to hear more about that at a different time. But what I want to focus on is at the very end of the Younger Dryas, 9,700 BC, that's where you see the steep curve bringing temperatures up to modern times. So does everyone see that on the left side? Up to modern times, and that was a dramatic event, something I've been interested in for literally 50 years. I hate to date myself because it goes back to when I was a college student and a graduate student, and back in the bad old days, we thought that the Ice Age ended very, very suddenly. But what did we call suddenly? We thought, oh, maybe the Ice Age ended in several centuries, 300, 400 years. Then in 2008, and don't try to read all this, I'm just showing you it's real. 2008, a paper came out that suggested the radical view that the Ice Age ended in just a few years, maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years, something like that, based on Greenland ice cores. And then this paper came out, and other papers have backed it up since, that no, the end of the last Ice Age literally happened in a very, very short period. What you're looking at from the right to the left, read it to the right to the left, is the last 3 years of the Younger Dryas. That's those tick marks at the top, or those gray boxes at the top mark the beginning of years. So the last 3 years of the Ice Age, and then the first year of what's known as the Holocene or post-Ice Age. And that big dark black bar, do you see that vertical black bar? That marks the end of the last ice age. So it's just a fraction of a year, literally as far as we can determine within, say, a 2-week period. But what that means is it actually could have been overnight, which I think is essentially what happened. And what would you have? How do you cause an ice age to end overnight? Literally, that's what we're talking about. So again, to review what I just said, you've got this cold snap known as the Younger Dryas that begins at 10,900 BCE. You then have the final incredibly sudden warming, literally within a few weeks, but probably overnight, at 9,700 BCE. What could cause this? Those who have heard me speak before and know my work know that I came to the conclusion about 15 years ago as a working hypothesis, and more data has now come to support that, I'm happy to say, that what caused the end of the last ice age was our sun, a major solar outburst. The sun is not always quiet. It's a star, and there are other solar-like stars that we now know about astrophysically, and a lot of this work is only in the literally last decade or even more recently. Sun-like stars tend to be unstable. We have been blessed as a civilization for a few thousand years having a relatively stable quiescent sun, but that's not the way the sun is geologically over time. Sometimes the sun undergoes major solar eruptions. It ejects what's known as plasma. Plasma is basically electrically charged particles, mostly protons and electrons, but other charged particles too, moving from when it's ejected by the sun at incredibly fast speeds, more or less a good percentage of the speed of light in some cases. And these outbursts, if they hit Earth, and they have hit the Earth, can cause massive destruction on the surface of the Earth. They can melt glaciers virtually instantaneously. They can end an ice age, and that's exactly what we've seen. They will, when they melt glaciers, I just want to mention this now, or they hit water, they put incredible amounts of moisture into the atmosphere. The atmosphere can only hold so much moisture, otherwise it comes down as what? Rain, huge torrential rains. Are there stories throughout the world in ancient times of huge torrential rains and flooding? Yes. And this all ties together. So we have all this data, especially from Greenland ice cores, from sediment cores, etc., that indicate the sun was very active. It underwent a solar outburst, and that's what ended the last ice age. Nowadays, we have what's known as the solar wind. And do we sometimes have what are known as coronal mass ejections, little outbursts from the sun? And does it sometimes cause problems, like causing satellites to fail, et cetera, or knock out grid systems temporarily, or maybe interfere with traffic control at airports? Yes. But that's nothing compared to what happened in the past. But mostly what we see are, pretty plasma effects like the aurora borealis, the northern lights, the southern lights, that type of thing. And this is courtesy of NASA, not to scale at all, but just showing how the solar wind and all the particles, they impact the Earth. The Earth is that little dot in the center of what looks like a spider, and it changes the magnetosphere, or I should say it bends the magnetosphere, etc. And it also, there's an issue of cosmic rays which can enter into the Earth's atmosphere. It gets very complicated, but all of this essentially, for the most part, is controlled by the sun and the solar activity. Someone who first really recognized this was a man named Thomas Gold, a brilliant astrophysicist at Cornell University, now deceased, and as early as the 1960s, he talked about the possibilities of major solar outbursts impacting the Earth-Moon system. When I say Earth-Moon system, you'll see why. But is the moon tied to the Earth? Say yes. Yes, yes. And if something hits the Earth, like a big solar outburst, a big coronal mass ejection, a proton, what they call solar particle event or solar proton event, will it hit the moon also? Yes, keep that in mind for the next slide. And back in the 1960s, Thomas Gold said, and I'm going to read this quote quickly, in the case of a, quote, big solar outburst, the Earth's magnetic field. So the magnetic field is incredibly important here because it protects us from cosmic rays. It protects us from particles coming from the sun. Is the magnetic field, as a side note, is it weakening at the moment? Yes. And is that intensifying the effects of any kind of solar outbursts or solar flares? Yes. So we live in dangerous times, but that's another story. The Earth's magnetic field, going back to gold, could clearly not hold up the incoming gas. That's what they called back then the plasma or charged particles, and it would indeed drive down to the atmospheric level. It would take the form of a series of sparks burning for extended periods of time and carrying currents of hundreds of millions of amperes. And so basically he said you would look for what would look like huge lightning bolts hitting the Earth, but it would not be lightning from atmospheric lightning, but literally coming from the sun, the solar plasma. And he said something you should look for is vitrification, because this would be so intense, so hot, that where it hits sand or rock surfaces, it would vitrify. What is vitrification? It means it would melt the surface of the rock or it would melt the sand, and then it would recongeal as basically a natural glass. Everyone with me? And he said, look for this. Other places where it hit, if it hit a glacier, it would just melt it. If it hit water, it would evaporate it. If it hit a forest, it would set the forest on fire, and you get all this evidence at the end of the last ice age. But vitrification and the moon, he actually found it on the moon, studying material that came back from the Apollo missions. This is actually from one of his papers published in Science, and the entire abstract of the paper, I love this short abstract, is some glazing is apparently due to radiation heating. When he says glazing, he's talking about what we now call vitrification. It suggests, he said, it suggests a giant solar outburst in geologically recent times. What's he referring to? He's talking about major solar outbursts at the end of the last ice age. That would be the geologically recent times. We start looking for this. We've got vitrification, for instance, in Egypt. This is what's known as the Libyan desert glass, which is actually found in Egypt, in what's known as the Libyan desert, but it's part of Egypt. And you've got approximately 2,500 square kilometers strewn with this natural glass. What's the standard explanation? It's a meteor or comet or something like that. It would have to be a huge meteor or comet to have that much natural glass over that large an area. There happens to be no crater associated with it, no definitive meteoritic material associated with it. Much better explanation, solar outbursts. Likewise, something like the Göbekli glass, which is another glass actually from Egypt, from the Western Desert. And this is a good example of what this natural glass often looks like. Do you see how it's sort of like scoria, or it's congealed? It's basically not very pretty glass, but it is glass in a technical, natural sense. And it sort of looks, do you see the bubbling nature of it? Very typical. I've studied this in various sites around the world. One is the Moat of Mark in Scotland. This is a bit younger me. I don't think I'm gray at all there. And what I'm holding in my hand is vitrified glass. Ancient vitrified glass. This site was used during the Dark Ages, so 500, 600, 700 AD. They lived in, quote, glass castles, which sounds very romantic, like a cathedral. No, this is the glass they're talking about. Does that make sense? It was vitrified ancient forts, quote unquote. But the thing is, these ancient structures were being reused in the Dark Ages, in the early medieval time, by bands of people, but they've actually been dated archaeologically back to the end of the last ice age. And these have been discussed in the literature going back at least to the 19th century. So for instance, this is a book on early fortifications in Scotland from the late 19th century. And look at the illustration on the right. What the author Christensen is showing, do you see how it's very dark? That's the outline of the, quote, fortification. That's the outline of the structure. And the dark area is where it's vitrified. And notice how it's vitrified on the outside of the wall on the right side and the inside of the wall on the left side. Do people see that? Which indicates which way the solar plasma discharge hit the structure. I think it's just very, very compelling when you look at this. These are my hands holding some of that vitrification on they call it a fort, but on the structure. The Sphinx itself has a history of being hit by plasma strikes, or, quote, lightning strikes, the ancient Egyptians called it. There's what's known as the inventory stela, which was found. It's now in the Cairo Museum system. It was found on the Giza Plateau, and it states that the Great Sphinx was hit by a thunderbolt, and that Khufu, who was supposedly the builder of the Great Pyramid long before the Sphinx ever existed, actually came to see the Sphinx and to see the thunderbolt that had hit the Sphinx. Well, how can you see a thunderbolt that hit the Sphinx? He wasn't actually looking at the thunderbolt. What he was looking at was vitrified rock, which was the result of the Sphinx and the plateau being hit. This is actually some pictures of me with some of the vitrification on the plateau, first pointed out to me by my friends and colleagues, Egyptian friends and colleagues, Yosef Alyan and Mohammed Ibrahim, and they showed this to me, and it's, my God, it was startling. There's vitrification of an incredible magnitude right on the Giza Plateau. Also, something else that Katie and I, my wife Katie, and I have pointed out or have found is that we have what are known as Lichtenberg patterns, or dendritic patterns emanating from under at least the Great Pyramid and the Second Pyramid. These would be patterns that you would see when a major plasma strike hit the plateau, and it spreads out and basically sends out channels of vitrification. The glass is no longer there. We've not been able to find any, but that's not unexpected because it will weather away very quickly. And if you've ever been to Giza, all the foot traffic and the camels and the donkeys and everything, I mean, you wouldn't expect to find a lot of fragile vitrification. What's really survived are the big chunks. But it's very interesting. In Scotland, another example, ancient megalithic site has been built on a very, very ancient lightning strike or plasma strike. So we're starting to find this around the world. And on top of the isotope data, the lunar data, etc., there's other data that ties in with this scenario. And this has been pioneered by Anthony Peratt, who is a plasma physicist. He's now retired. I've first met him back in I forget when, a long time ago, 25 years ago maybe or so. Didn't know how to put it all together then. Now it all starts to make sense. but he was at Los Alamos National Laboratory for decades, one of the premier plasma physicists in the world, and studying high intensity, high energy plasma physics at a large scale. What will you get, for instance, during a solar outburst? And what he determined is that at very high intensities, you get very, very distinct shapes that you would see in the sky. So again, think about the aurora borealis, or the northern lights, or the aurora australis, the southern lights. Not just sort of vague curtains of light, but if it starts taking on distinct shapes, this is what he determined. It would take on, some of them would like stick figures, etc. I'll come to that in a minute. But what he found is that going for walks and going in the New Mexico desert around Los Alamos, he found the same shapes on petroglyphs, ancient rock art that was showing the same depictions. He was amazed at this because it was costing them millions of dollars to run experiments to learn what was happening during a major plasma outburst, yet here it was recorded on ancient rocks. And his basic conclusion was, well, yeah, the people had seen this in the sky and they recorded what was going on. Just a couple of pictures. We've seen nothing like this of such great intensity in modern times, but just to give a sense of how it will start to take shape, especially the one on the right. Do you see how that starts to look like a figure with its hands up in the air? Yeah, so again, we're lucky we haven't seen this in modern times, because if we did, it would wipe out all our electronics, etc. But he started to model this. And some of the classic figures look like stick figure men with dots on their sides, which is actually plasma discharges and synchrotron radiation. And he modeled and distinguished a number of different features. Some of them are stick figure men with dots on their sides, stick figure men with birds' heads. The Birdman, you need to keep that in mind. The concept of the Birdman, and I'll come back to that even in South America, is very important for ancient cultures around the world. And I think it's more than that birds fly and people admire that birds fly. They saw birdmen in the sky, at least what they interpreted as looking like birdmen, at the end of the last ice age during these plasma outbursts. And they saw what looked like humanoid figures in the sky, what looked like gods in the sky, if you would. They also, something that Dr. Perat's modeled are donut-like cylindrical shapes, so you see these. And his team, his group, he and his group started becoming fascinated by this. They actually went around the world looking to see if they would find similar shapes in the ancient petroglyphs, and sure enough, they did. In over 130 countries, they found these same shapes. And he could even figure out the point of view. Where were they looking when they were drawing these on boulders or cave walls, that type of thing? And he could model how the plasma at the end of the last ice age entered the Earth's magnetosphere and entered the Earth system and spread around the Earth. Because right now we have the auroras only at high latitudes normally. When you have a lot of solar activity, what happens? You can start to see it at lower latitudes. In fact, just recently, somewhere visible in Boston, I think in New York, etc. But if you have a major solar outburst, what will happen? It will spread, it will follow the magnetic fields, and you will see it literally around the world. We know this from modern experience, what was known as the 1859 Carrington event. Literally, they saw auroras and stick-like figures and other figures, as Dr. Perat has described, vaguely around the world, but it was not as intense as you would get at the end of the last ice age. Notice in the bottom left, do you see how there's stick figures with what look like birds' heads on them, or birds on them? Everyone see that? So that was the foundation for the birdmen or the bird women, the bird people. More from Dr. Perat. And I want to point out, I'm going to go back for a second. Do real people have dots on their sides like this? So, I mean, you find this around the world. It's not just that they couldn't draw people. No, they were recording what they actually saw. Here's more. You can see on the left in particular what's very nice images of sort of stick figures with birds' heads from Arizona, Saudi Arabia, literally around the world. These are some that Katie and I got to visit and analyze in Osvik, Norway when we were there at one point. Same pattern, same thing. Something else that's very important is Easter Island because it fits in with this story. And we have, when I say we, Katie, my wife, and I have worked on this, and we've expanded on Dr. Perot's work. And Easter Island is a fascinating place. It's one of the most remote locations on Earth, which I think is important because it's not been, quote, totally untouched, but it's preserved traditions, I believe, going back, in my opinion, thousands and thousands of years, probably back to the end of the last ice age. So keep that in mind as I talk about Easter Island. It's a fascinating place with the moai. That's me with one of the smaller moai. And there's just a wonderful place. It has birdmen. Remember I was just talking about birdmen? Birdmen is a common theme on Easter Island. These are some of the beautiful petroglyphs with birdmen carved on them. I think you should be able to see them, but if you can't, this is from 1924 from a book by Brown in 1924 where they chalked them in so you could see them more clearly. They don't do that anymore. But what the Easter Island is also known for is the Rongo script. This is indigenous to Easter Island, and it's considered to this day one of the great mysteries of linguistics because supposedly it has not been interpreted, it has not been deciphered, it has not been decoded. But I would disagree with that now because Catherine Ulysses, my wife, first noticed after we went to Easter Island for the first time in 2010. We're studying everything about Easter Island, and we're looking at the Rongo, and she knows that the characters of Rongo, the so-called glyphs, sure look a lot like the plasma petroglyphs and the plasma configurations that Dr. Perot had been studying. And actually, we published this, and then a member of Dr. Perot's team said, yes, we were correct. They had made the same discovery, but they had not publicized it. They had not published it. And they even talked about how they were using this as basically a text of what you should look for or what features you would see in the sky as the sun went through different periods of activity. When you had major solar events. And so, in fact, you have all the distinct plasma shapes identified in the Rongo that you have with Dr. Perot's work and the petroglyphs. Here's some comparisons. If you want to look at these more closely, I have this in my book, Forgotten Civilization. Incidentally, the Rongo glyphs we think also tie in with the Nazca, and there's evidence of, quote, major lightning strikes on the Nazca plain in ancient times. Well, is this sort of a branding, if you would, of these configurations, of these forms on the Nazca lines that were then used and venerated and used over and over again by later cultures? And you have all kinds of other birdmen comparisons. Even here, in the upper right, I was showing the Easter Island versus Göbekli Tepe comparisons. It starts to get very interesting. The hands, I mentioned this before, the hands on Easter Island versus Göbekli Tepe, and this is a theme you see around the world. Or this little statue with no mouth on the left is from Easter Island. It's a female, what they call a little female moai. And I actually start to see similarities with things like Urfaman, or on Easter Island, there's a tradition of carving these small, they're known as moai kava kava and moai tangada. And very similar, some of the structures are not structures, sculptures you find in Turkey and elsewhere. So I think there's a lot of shared similarities. The headdress on Easter Island, it's very similar to what you find with the whirling dervishes. C.J. Ransom, another plasma physicist, has suggested that these headdresses are what you would have seen on what would look like anthropomorphic cone heads or images in the sky during a solar outburst. That, in fact, this may tie in again. Francis Mazire suggested or recorded in 1963 this weird, which people didn't understand, weird legend on Easter Island about somehow the sky falling down in the time of Proto-Hittite, who was sort of a legendary king of Easter Island, and that sky fell down and it stayed that way for a while, fell from above onto the earth. The people cried out, the sky is fallen. In the days of King Proto-Hittite, he took hold, he waited a given time, the sky returned, it went away, and it stayed up there. Well, this could, I think, poetically be describing a solar outburst that the Easter Islanders, the Rapa Nui, were recording. So I think there are benign examples today, but more severe in the past. I also want to point out that there's a lot of interesting things about Easter Island itself. I love Easter Island. So, for instance, the classic view, as expressed by a guy named Stephen Roger Fisher, who's an expert supposedly on Easter Island, attacking Thor Heyerdahl. Have you heard of Thor Heyerdahl before? Very important figure. He talks about, I'll read it quickly, Easter Island's one and only settlers were not South Americans. In the last quarter of the 20th century, this long contentious issue was resolved once and for all, by the cumulative scientific evidence that confirmed Easter Island's exclusively Polynesian patrimony. More or less, Easter Islands were just Polynesians, end of story, nothing else. I just want to show you how things can change and should change with more evidence. The late Thor Heyerdahl, a great adventurer, great archaeologist, great scholar, he suggested that no, Easter Islanders were partly Polynesian, but partly from the Americas. And he demonstrated how with rafts you could, known as the Kon-Tiki. His raft was the Kon-Tiki, and it was a big, elaborate balsa wood raft. You could cross the Pacific. He also demonstrated how in reed boats, modeled on ancient Egyptian pictographs, modeled on ancient Egyptian reliefs, reed boats could cross the Atlantic. So ancient people in remote times could cross the oceans. And he pointed out, these are my photographs, but he pointed out how at Tiwanaku in La Paz, Bolivia, you have sculptures like this, but he excavated and found the sculpture in the middle on Easter Island. Do they look a little bit similar? And he thought they looked quite similar. He also pointed out other, and this is just a couple of them, how you have on Easter Island what's known as Ahu Vinipu, this beautiful megalithic stone wall, very similar to Sacsayhuaman in Peru. And he argued that, yes, there was a South American component to Easter Island. That was laughed on. He was basically drummed out of, polite society, of academia, et cetera, died, but has since been vindicated. And genomic data now, and there are now a number of studies that have come out that conclude that, yes, Easter Islanders had a South American component also. That, yes, in a bigger picture, there was trade, there was interaction among ancient people that was never expected by the standard archaeologists. Another thing is a standard chronology of Easter Island. I, as an academic, must acknowledge that my colleagues tend to think that Easter Island was not inhabited until 1,500 years ago, or maybe as recently as 800 years ago. This just doesn't make sense. to me, and I'm going to give you a few tidbits here. For instance, at what's known as Orongo on Easter Island, this statue was found. It's a basalt moai. It's now in the British Museum. Some people would like to liberate it and put it back on Easter Island, but that's another story. It's carved out of basalt. The quarries have never been found for the basalt moai. There's another basalt moai in Oahu. Can you see his back there? The shape of his back? And this was being reused. These basalt moai were being reused. Again, Thor Heyerdahl, they found this little, I showed you a picture of it already, little female basalt moai. They found part of it in 1956. They found another part in 1988. The point is the basalt moai, and here she is, we don't know the quarries. Most of the moai are carved out what's known as tuff, basically congealed volcanic ash, which is relatively soft to carve. Basalt is much more difficult to carve, much harder, lasts longer, and all the evidence is that the few basalt moai were probably the models, if you would, for the later moai and go back to an earlier period. And where are their quarries? I suggest that their quarries have not been found because basalt would be stratigraphically lower, and it's probably off the coast now. But at the end of the last ice age, sea levels were what? Much lower. Easter Island was larger, and I suspect those basalt quarries will be found there. In fact, there's even suggestions that Jacques Cousteau, the late Jacques Cousteau and his team, when they were on Easter Island and they were diving around the edge of it, that they saw what looked like quarries off the coast. And that's something I want to explore further. Here's another thing. Here's Anakina on Easter Island in 2010. A picture that we took when we were there. We've been there several times. Here is Anakina in 1987. But look at the bottom right of the picture. That's Thor Heyerdahl and his team. They are excavating. Do you see that beautiful wall there? If it's lower stratigraphically, it's what? Much older. Now, this has been covered up again. I was told, because it was a safety hazard. People might fall and hurt themselves. Then you have things like this, the moai. Look at how on the right and on the left too, but especially on the right from Thor Heyerdahl, one of the excavations he did, these moai are huge, covered with sediment like this. I don't believe for a second that they just dug holes to dump them in as soon as they carved them, which is one of the standard explanations. I don't believe that because it doesn't make sense to me, but more importantly, I don't believe it because when I look at the sedimentology and stratigraphy, it doesn't match artificial being put into a hole. I think what's happening here is the sediments piled up slowly and gradually. These are much older than standard dating, what have you, believe. And here's a paper that came out, and there's been more since then, that suggests that Easter Island, instead of being colonized 800 or 1,500 years ago, goes back at least to the first millennium, at least in this paper 450 BC, based on plant material and other material. And I suggest that this is just a tip of the proverbial iceberg, that we're going to push these dates even further back, and we already are. Also, this paper acknowledges that, yes, once again, Thor Heyerdahl was correct, that there was a South American influence in Easter Island. So I point this out because should dogma have any place in science? No, I don't think so, because dogma is something, I'm defining dogma as something you believe and that's it and it's infallible. No, that's not the way it works. We have to look at the data, we have to develop more data and expect more surprises. Getting back to the end of the last ice age, 9700 BCE, no doubt in my mind that was a solar outburst. Since I've been talking about this for the last 15 years, I'm not claiming any credit here, but other people have been looking at solar activity through various proxies like isotope data and tree rings, etc., and you don't need to read all of these. This is just to show we are finding the sun is incredibly unstable. And there's been a number of events since the end of the last ice age, not as great as what brought the end of the last ice age to a close, but significant nonetheless. If any of these events happened tomorrow, would we all miss our flights if you're flying? Say yes. Yes. And if you're driving, your car would probably not what? Start, because it's basically just a computer on wheels and it would be fried, etc. And just recently, in the last month or so, another paper came out. This is actually looking at another major solar event going back before the end of the last ice age. And the little graph that they have on the bottom is, do you see the blue stars? Those are different major solar events that have occurred. The scale there is from before the end of the last ice age on the left up to the present day. And what is in pink is sunspot activity, which is interesting because the sun can seem like it's fairly normal, and can it all of a sudden have an outburst? Yes, it can be very erratic, very sensitive. Probably conscious, I'll get to that. So the evidence suggests that there's these cataclysmic events. People like Plato, remember Plato? And Plato talked about what? Atlantis, etc. I'm not going to get into Atlantis now. That would be just too much, unless you want me to talk till midnight. But wiped out advanced civilizations. And when you have a major solar outburst, I've mentioned some of this already, you can have huge glaciers releasing pressure in the crust. You have earthquakes. We now know there's very good evidence that solar activity, even modern times, can set off earthquakes. That seems weird until you start thinking about it. Solar activity ties in with electromagnetic activity, which ties in with rocks because many have piezoelectric effect, et cetera, et cetera. And think about, avalanches, snow avalanches? Did I get that right? Where it can just be on the verge and you clap your hands, they say, and it can cause a huge avalanche, that type of thing. Or landslides, can very small trigger effects cause a landslide that's basically ready to happen? Yes. So you get that. Deluges of biblical proportions, the flooding around the world that's been recorded in every ancient tradition, including the heart of Africa, ties in with this because you would be putting so much moisture in the atmosphere that has to come down as precipitation. On top of that, what happens? Sea levels rising, etc., inundating coastal areas. But have we seen major floods just in modern times from virtually nothing? Say yes. Yes, yes. I mean, you hear about news, West Virginia or whatever. I'm not making fun of West Virginia, flood. Think about when you have a major solar outburst, like at the end of the last ice age, or which will happen in the future. Depletion of the stratospheric ozone, causing radiation levels to rise, incineration. Really, I hate talking about this in some sense because it's sort of scary, but bad things happen. One thing that happens is mammals can go extinct. Large animals can go extinct. We see extinctions at the end of the last ice age. No, they're not the beginning of the Younger Dryas. They're actually at the end of the Younger Dryas. They're at the end of the last ice age. When you look at all the data, this is a published article in I think Proceedings of the National Academy of Science demonstrating that. And what you have is that the large mammals can't escape. I just mentioned how ozone depletion and other factors would cause high radiation levels. They are high enough. My colleague and friend, who is now deceased, unfortunately, recently, Paul LaViolette, calculated that you could have high enough radiation levels on the surface of the Earth to cause large mammals, and humans are large mammals, to die from radiation poisoning in, I think he said 5 or 6 days, according to his calculations, if you don't escape. How can you escape? You go underground. Small mammals often burrow and live underground. They're used to going underground. If there's huge solar outbursts in the sky, they'll get scared, and what will they do? They'll hide under rocks and underground. Large mammals, unless they're cave bears and certain other types of mammals or humans near caves, don't have that option. What are the mass extinctions? They're top of the food chain. They're the large mammals. Humans in some areas went underground. Natural caves, then they developed further caves. Sometimes people say to me, well, how did they know to have all these caves ready or underground cities ready? There's two aspects to that. One, I think they start with natural caves. Also, the last major solar outburst at the end of the last ice age, that was not the first one. The Göbekli Tepe people are the original builders of what we now call the Sphinx. I think their civilization went back far enough in time. They had experienced other major solar outbursts. So they knew the signs. Maybe that's the Rongo record of it. They knew what to look for. They knew what to expect. If you expect a nuclear war, are you going to start building fallout shelters ahead of time? Yeah, in fact, did that happen in America and other countries? Yeah. Something that Katie and I had the privilege of doing years ago now, we were in Albania. We went to Albania. And Albania, I don't know if you know anyone from Albania, they have a huge underground network of bunkers and whatnot, which were built in case of nuclear war. It's a great place to be during a major solar outburst because they've already got the underground shelters in place. But that's how you would have to survive. So yeah, some of these may be post-ice age, but they were preparing in case it happened again. Others may have been from even earlier phases of solar outbursts. Easter Island, you have these thick stone houses, which are essentially artificial caves that would serve the same purpose for protection, and they lived in caves on Easter Island for thousands of years, according to one of our guides when we were talking to him. He was a native. He knew nothing about our work, Katie and my work, but he talked about how, oh yeah, they used to live in the caves for thousands of years. Well, why would you do that? Oh, you know, weird stuff happening in the sky. There I am emerging from one. It's interesting, these caves, they would close them up to very narrow little openings, which is exactly what you would want to do if you're talking about protecting yourself from things like solar outbursts. If you're trying to protect yourself from enemies, that's not going to work. What are they going to do? They're just going to block you in and let you starve to death. Junta in India, I'm just giving a few examples. You have the same thing. Yeah, these were reused by Buddhist monks or whatever later and recarved, but I think that their origins go back to a much earlier period. These are carved out of what's known as the Deccan traps, which is a basalt, very hard, very difficult to work. Why go through that effort? Why go through that effort unless there's a real reason to do it? But probably the quintessential area is Cappadocia in Turkey. Cappadocia, or Cappadocia, if you want to say it that way, in Turkey. And there you have a long tradition of living in underground cities, living in caves, living in rock houses, if you would. This is from a balloon. You can see people still inhabit them, still live in them. And you have underground cities like during Kuyu. Another one is Kamakoli, which are multi-story. Here I am in one of them. Multi-story, incredible structures. And you have here an area where people survived. They survived the decimation at the end of the last ice age, and then they reemerged. They sustained a large enough population. Some of these underground cities could literally hold thousands of people, plus animals, plus storage, et cetera, et cetera. And just as a side note, the traditional archaeological view is that they're not that old, but somehow they just carved them. And why did they carve them? Well, they wanted to escape from their enemies. If you were escaping from your enemies, would you go underground and have huge piles of debris on the surface to show exactly where you are? No, it would make no sense. And where are those huge piles of debris now? If they were only a few thousand years old, these underground cities, I would expect to find, as a geologist, these piles of debris and whatnot. They basically don't exist. If they go back 12,000 years or so, I would expect that, yes, the debris would have, at that point, scattered, eroded away, etc. Am I making sense? Yeah, so there's lots of reasons, which I can't go into all of them now, why no, these are not just to protect them from their enemies. They're not just a few thousand years old. I think they are a tradition that goes back to that early period. When you go to visit them, do you find that some of them were reused as churches in Roman and Byzantine times and reused by the Hittites even earlier, etc.? Yes, of course. Well, they're there. Why not use them if you know about them? Just like the Sphinx was reused. That doesn't mean that's their origin. Here's some interesting data about their origin. So here's Turkey, just to orient you again. And there have been linguistic studies. This was published in Science in 2012. Linguistic studies where you can trace back the origins of languages, doing the family tree of languages. And when you do this, the brown spot, do you see the brown spot in the middle of the map there? That's Anatolia. That's the Cappadocia, Göbekli Tepe region. And what you see along the top is they're tracing back the language families. It's basically the genealogy of the languages, and that they all go back to that region in Cappadocia / Turkey at the end of the last ice age. And then the populations and the languages spread out from there. Totally independent data, but confirming, I believe, corroborating what I'm talking about. So you've got Sida, you've got things going back thousands of years earlier, and the legends talk about that. Before I move on to other things, the question people often ask is, will it happen again? Well, of course it will happen again. We may be overdue because Thomas Gold suggests every 10,000 years off the top of his head. If you start looking at solar activity, and this chart is solar activity from basically the end of the last ice age in the upper left-hand corner, running across towards from left to right. Then you're at 4,000 BCE, and then from the bottom picking up 4,000 BCE up to the present. And notice how solar activity sort of calmed down after the end of the last ice age, although there was a lot of fluctuation there. But very recently, what's happening, it's becoming very active again. The sun is becoming very active again, so be warned. So we have what Katie and I call solar-induced dark age from about 9700 BCE to the beginning of re-emergence of civilization, not the beginning of civilization, but re-emergence of civilization some 6,000 years later, say 3700 BCE, for around 6,000 years. And this is all explained really by the sun. And the sun is really a keystone to all of this. The sea level changes, the flooding, the die-off of large mammals and humans in some places, underground cities, the plasma petroglyphs, and also what we can call solar worship. So I want to talk about the sun and solar worship for a few minutes, because there's more, I think, to the message of the ancients. There's a real spiritual side. In Egypt, which I spent a lot of time in Egypt, they recognize the sun as being so important. It's the life bearer, it's the life giver, but it can also be ferocious. and it can destroy everything. And they acknowledge that. People used to take this as a metaphor. Oh, you can go out in the desert and get a sunburn. No, they were talking about more than that. And what we can talk about is sacred science. So we have scientific messages expressed through art and architecture across a number of cultures. And I think there's a bigger message here that relates to plasma and our sun and the star. In India, for instance, the sun is considered the physical manifestation of God. And I think we have to start thinking about that in a more literal sense than most people want to. Again, being radical here. This is from India when we traveled there. I love this little thing. It says, the right and true path leads to the formless one God, the sun. The sun is a god. The ancient Egyptians thought that they believed that we could be reborn as stars in the sky. That is, that we could basically become the sun. This is from a sarcophagus in one of the Cairo museums. I say one of the Cairo museums because they've been moving things around now. But it suggests or talks about how we become stars, we can become the sun. It also suggests that the sun is conscious. The ancient people around the world tended to think of the sun as a god and as a conscious entity. And I have begun to take that very seriously, that consciousness is well beyond just humans, well beyond humans and dogs and other mammals, well beyond humans and vertebrates, well beyond just living organisms, but consciousness actually pervades the universe. Here is from actually Tutankhamun. If you can see the humans or the mummies going up to the stars or connected to the stars. Here we see the sky, ancient Egyptian rendition of the sky with cartouches because the pharaohs become the stars. And here we have Katie and myself when we first met back in 2007, and she suggested that maybe there really was something to this. We talked about this, one of our first discussions at a conference, talked about how I have till 7:30. Yeah. Not 7 o'clock. Were you trying to tell me I'm supposed to end? Yeah. Right? Yeah, okay. Okay, because I still have a lot to cover. And we start late. That we can be reborn in the sky as stars, that the Egyptians thought that and suggested that, Katie suggested that actually ties in with modern science and the cycle of hydrogen. Because what are stars, solar stars at least, made of? Primarily hydrogen. And what is hydrogen? Basically protons and electrons. What is plasma? Most plasma in the universe is 99.9% plus plasma. Basically hydrogen ionized, protons, electrons, etc. This is what you have with the sun. And when hydrogen forms clouds, when it's light, it floats up to the sky, it forms clouds. This is a classic concept of how solar-like stars are formed. Most stars are primarily hydrogen. And she hypothesized that when we die, our hydrogen is released from us. It carries information about us. And then it floats up to the sky, it gathers into these hydrogen clouds or joins the sun, it collapses into stars or suns or the sun, our sun. So essentially particles of us are carried up and they can carry information that has basically been encoded in us during our lifetime. And this may sound crazy, but it shouldn't sound crazy because there's actually good science to back it up. For instance, Luc Montagnier, he's now deceased, but he was 2008 Nobel Prize winner. He did incredibly important work, which a lot of the scientific establishment tried to dismiss, but they really could not. And I've looked at all his original papers, that water, which is primarily hydrogen and oxygen, can carry information, he said, as electromagnetic imprint from DNA, other molecules. This ties in with the whole concept of homeopathy, but also with hydrogen and protons and electrons being able to encode, carry information in a manner that no one ever suspected. It probably ties in with a lot of you have probably heard about Emoto and his work. That also was sort of dismissed by a lot of people, how water will respond or hydrogen will respond. We think it's primarily the hydrogen, to emotions, to thoughts, to patterns. And a lot of people tried to dismiss it, but his work has actually been replicated also. So there's all this data that, yes, you can encode information. I have to mention here Cleve Baxter, who did work on what he called primary perception in plants, and that plants can respond to thoughts and whatnot. And what is in plants? Primarily hydrogen again, in the water and the carbohydrates, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it starts to tie in. And what one can suggest is that when we physically die, our hydrogen, its constituent subatomic particles, is released. The hydrogen carries information. It's probably been entangled in us to a great extent, and I'm talking about quantum entanglement, and closely connected, and then it can later aggregate, stay in communication, and our personality, our consciousness can be passed on to a certain extent from this life and to survive potentially in some kind of recognizable form in the future. And it may be important and necessary to combine, reintegrate these psychic components in the hereafter or in a star, as the ancient Egyptians talked about, that literally could go up, that stars like our sun are collections of consciousness to a certain extent. If you think about our own body, what do we have? A lot of different cells, but we have even more bacterial cells, and arguably every little bacterial cell is conscious at a certain level. You can demonstrate that. They respond to stimuli, et cetera, et cetera. And then the question of matter and consciousness are interlinked. But what's more fundamental? I actually suspect ultimately information and consciousness go together. I like this quote from Max Planck, who I think is one of the great physicists of the last 150 years, one of the greatest. He was founder, of course, of quantum physics, and he wrote, and I looked this quote up, it's real, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything we talk about, everything that we regard as existing postulates consciousness. And what's in our physical world, the most fundamental material expressions of consciousness, I would postulate are electrons, protons. This gets back to what Katie talked about in her theory. And getting back to ancient Egyptians, everyone probably has a concept that the ancient Egyptians talked about different, what I call soul components, different aspects of the personality, different aspects of the body. Is what they were talking about, does it tie in here? So for instance, they talked about the Khat, the physical body, the Ka, which is sort of a replica of the physical body, what people later called the astral body or the ethereal body, the Ba. I won't go through all of these now, but the Kabit, the Ba, the Kabit, etc. Actually, in many ways, the Ba was the soul proper for them, the most important aspect. It was often represented, and these are late 19th century renditions or diagrams of it, represented as a human-headed bird, the Ba, the soul. But this was just one component of the person, one component of the personality. There's the Ba bird in one of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And this brings me to something I want to talk about for a few minutes. That is the Serapeum in Egypt. The Serapeum occurs on the Saqqara Plateau. It's near, something else that's famous on the Saqqara Plateau is the Zoser Pyramid, or Dozier Pyramid. But the Serapeum, maybe some of you have had a chance to visit it. It's a very interesting structure. The classic view is that, oh, it's for the Apis bulls, that they're basically sarcophagi for the Apis bulls, but none have actually been found in it. That whole thing is maybe questionable, or maybe a later reuse. But when you go there, you have to go underground for the Serapeum. It's actually literally in the limestone bedrock. And what you find when you go in is these corridors, these incredible long corridors. Now, some of that, do you see the arches and whatnot? That's modern too, because they were worried that it might collapse, although it had not collapsed for thousands and thousands of years. But, you know, the Egyptians wanted to add their touch, the modern Egyptians. And what you find are these huge coffers, these huge boxes of granite, multi-ton boxes, and they're very mysterious, they're very strange, they're beautifully carved, and again, the classic view is that they were coffins for bulls, for sacred bulls. Male cows, basically. And some of them, how did they even move them? Here's a coffer. You see how it barely fits in this space to move it around. The whole thing is very strange and mysterious. There I am on the right for scale on one of them. There's Katie and I. But you look at these and you can see a few people there for scale. What are these? What was their purpose? I'm going to throw out a hypothesis here that Katie proposed, which I find incredibly interesting, that maybe they could have had the original purpose of being sealed boxes to combine and unite the hydrogen, if you would, of the soul, of the deceased, of the person, to try to recombine them, integrate them. A term that's been used in the 20th century and 21st century in some occult circles is to crystallize the personality, to bring the components of the personality back. If you're going to have an afterlife, if you're going to have some kind of continuity after physical death, whether it's joining the sun and the stars or otherwise, that you have to do that. That part of the, and I don't want to sound too strange here, but it's hard spiritual work to put those components together and integrate them, that this may have been partly what was involved here, putting the soul components that the Egyptians talked about back together. Yes, a couple of them have inscriptions on them. I don't know if you can see them from this photograph, but these inscriptions are really crude. Really crude. They're ancient, and I suggest once again we have a situation here where this is being reused. These are ancient things that are being reused, maybe for a different purpose, maybe in Ptolemaic times for the Apis bulls. That doesn't mean that was their original purpose. Here's another one from ancient Egypt. Studying this statue, we suggest it is basically saying we become the sun. It actually incorporates a number of plasma physics depictions on it. If you start thinking about what I was talking about before with Dr. Parad, it's now in the Egyptian Museum. I'm not sure if it's been moved recently, but it has a message from plasma physics. It has a symbol of the plasma of the sun, and when you look at it from the side view, what do you see? The Birdman, representing eternal life, representing the sun, solar deity. You have the bird-headed man or the birdman. You have the lion chair. The lion is associated with the sun. You have cascaded rings, that's solar plasma. You have the plasma torus that supports it all. You have what looks like basically remember the petroglyphs of Perat and the Rongo, you have something very similar on the side of the chair. So basically it's all saying, it's essentially what we call a symphony in stone that's saying we become the sun, we become the stars, that we can have eternal life, essentially if we work at it, I would add. Here's another example, Anubis, Lord of the Dead, standing over the deceased who's lying or being carried on a lion bed, representing the sun plasma. This is from Valley of the Kings. Here, I don't think this is just a cow palette as they call it, but look how similar it is to the configurations you would see in the sky during a major solar outburst. You have the same thing in South America. This is from Tiwanaku. There we have the Birdman and plasma symbols in South America. Tiwanaku in Bolivia, I just want to mention it very briefly. It's incredible. It has the gateway of the sun. Again, the sun is so important for so many ancient cultures. Just a closer view. This is an old photograph where it wasn't so badly eroded. And when you look at it, you have the, quote, sun god holding two staffs. What is this? I think this is solar symbolism. You have plasma columns. You have the positive and the negative. When plasma winds around what sometimes are known as Birkeland currents, it has two basically columns that wind around each other. They separate magnetically and wind around each other. This is a stylized version or rendition in art, I think, of basic plasma physics. And you have the Birdman with plasma columns too. This is very interesting. You have the base of what's known as a pyramid. You have these incredible structures. I won't go into all these now. Beautiful figures, et cetera, et cetera. And this was studied, and I want to make a couple more points here. This was studied by Arthur Poznansky back in the early 20th century. He spent over 40 years studying it, and he dated it to before the end of the last ice age in modern terms, to about before 10,000 BCE. This wasn't taken seriously by academics at the time. To this day, it's dismissed by academics. But I want to mention it, especially since this is a solstice, and you've heard about the solstice, and we had a solstice trip yesterday. Right here in North Carolina, based on the positions of the solstices, which change over time, he was convinced that, yes, it's crudely, approximately oriented to the solstices today, but in fact, because of changes in the obliquity of the ecliptic of, the sun and the earth, that and don't try to read the small print there. I summarized it in the large type there. He was convinced that no, it doesn't align precisely to the solstices today, but it did in approximately 15,000 BCE, which would be astounding if the site is that old. Is it that old? I will tell you, I don't know. But I do want to mention that even before radiocarbon dating, other people, so for instance, Alfred Lewis Kroeber, who, if you know anything about anthropology, he was one of the great anthropologists of the late 19th, early 20th century, died in 1960, in a review of Poznansky's book where he proposed this, he had I don't say gall, but he gave the standard view that Peruvian, American, British, and German scholars have estimated the absolute chronology of Tiwanaku horizon somewhat variably, but seem in general agreement that its beginnings are not earlier than about 600 AD, while some reduce the span. So he was basically saying, Poznansky, you are crazy to put it back so early. Later data, and I just show this quickly, radiocarbon dates have been done. Well, the earliest radiocarbon dates so far go back 1,400 years earlier than Kroeber was talking about. They go back to the mid-first millennium BCE. I wonder how much further back they could go. And another thing I suggest, or I've thought about, is even if it's not physically dated to 15,000 BCE, the physical remains we have now, could the site have memorialized or been dedicated to an earlier period, an acknowledgement of an earlier period? So just like the ancient Egyptians talked about an earlier cycle of civilization, which they called Zeptepe, a very early period of civilization, which all the academics dismissed, for so long, we now have evidence for. So could Tiwanaku in some ways, maybe if it's not the physical remains itself, could it memorialize an early civilization or earlier period in time? Or could this physical remains still exist under what we have and is unrecognized? I want to draw the analogy here to our comparison to Robert Bauval, my colleague and friend Robert Bauval. He came up, of course, with the Orion correlation theory that the Giza pyramids, the major Giza pyramids, correlate with the belt of Orion, but not in 2500 BCE or 2500 AD even, but closer, he put it closer to 10,500 BCE. He has not necessarily argued, and we've talked about that quite a bit, he and I, he's not necessarily argued that the pyramids themselves are that old, but that they memorialize a period that far back, which actually we have the physical remains of with the Sphinx, and potentially, this is me speaking now, with the structures that were the original pyramids from that period, which I think were rebuilt and reused later. One of the problems with a place like Tiwanaku is that it has suffered greatly over the centuries and millennia. So here's a church, a Christian church at Tiwanaku. This is from Poznański, 1945 volume, and this is built literally with stones taken from the ancient site. Here's the back of the church. Here's another picture of the church with some of the ancient sculptures adorning it. So when you've got these statues and these structures so vandalized, it's very hard to put it back together and get anything realistic dating. Here's a picture I took recently on a trip there of some stones, and here's a picture from Poznański in 1945. Notice how that's exactly the same stone, but now they've moved it around and put it up for display. Another site that's associated with Tiwanaku, actually part of the same overall complex. Many of you have heard about Pumapunku. Everyone's heard about Pumapunku because it has these incredible blocks. It's an interesting site with incredible H blocks are very famous there. Other blocks are there. These are pictures from a couple of different trips that I've taken there. Beautifully carved. People talk about how could they carve such things with such finesse at such an early period, and also questionable how old is it. According to Poznański, if you buy his argument that this goes back to what I'll call the end of the last ice age, then Pumapunku is part of that too. Again, I'm not advocating that. I'm just looking at the evidence, and I am still up in the air as to exactly how far back these go. But I think we have to consider the possibilities. There I am with one of them. Here's another trip with some of the H block, and they are incredibly beautifully carved, you know, the finesse, etc. But the issue is, what are the techniques? How were these carved? Something that is in a lot of discussion now is, are some of these artificial rocks, are they genuinely natural rocks? So a lot of discussion recently, and this is, when I say recently, it's actually been going on for a very long time, whether you're talking about natural rock or artificial rock, or are you talking about, we'll call it poured rock, or some kind of false rock. I'm talking as a geologist now, or something that is suggesting that it's not natural rock. Poznański talked about this almost 100 years ago, 80 years ago, in his massive volume on Tiwanaku. Just a quick quote here. Since so many hypotheses have been advanced with regard to the raw material from which the massive monuments of Tiwanaku, and with that he includes Pumapunku, were carved, it is necessary to treat this point, even though only briefly, since a majority of people believe that the artisans of Tiwanaku possessed the secret of molding stone. More or less, was it poured? Was it cast? stone. And he looked at this very carefully. He wrote or was quoted in a book in 1907 saying, this is a quote from Poznański, in 1907, the material was probably brought from an extinct volcano situated about 50 miles distant from Tiwanaku. The founders of the ancient city made use of the liquid lava of the volcano, which was at that time in eruption, bringing it by means of canals to the foot of the mountain where it flowed into earthen molds, a primitive method employed today in the molding of liquid iron. In Tiwanaku are found molds which indicate that they were used for casting the idols, their outlines having the same appearance as those which are now used in casting iron. So at that point, he was actually suggesting they were bringing in lava, liquid, casting it into these shapes, and then letting it congeal rather than carving it. That makes sense to everyone? I mean, what he was trying to say. Then, 40 years later, he writes this. And I'm just showing this as he changed his mind. I'm not actually judging either way at the moment. He says, in 1945, he writes, naturally, with this chapter, that is this chapter in the book of 1945, we are withdrawing an old hypothesis which we advanced 40 years ago with regard to the blocks of Tiwanaku. In order to carry out these studies, microtomic sections were first made of the different samples, and then microphotographs were taken of them with polarized light. They have served as the basis of the present chapter, and we insert them as illustrations. And this is very interesting to me as a geologist, someone who's trained, among other things, petrography. He did petrographic analysis of a number of the samples. This is something I'd like to get permission to collect samples in repeat, and he came to the conclusion when he did this that yes, these in fact are natural rock, that they must have been quarrying it, they must have been using some kind of very advanced techniques to quarry it, to move it, to carve it, which to me is even more amazing in some ways than molding it. But the bottom line is, I'm saying right now, I don't know. I will say when I don't know something, I am up in the air. How did they carve? How did they create some of these? I think it's a continuing mystery. Getting back to H symbols that we see at Pumapunku, we have H symbols at Göbekli Tepe. We have them at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. Remember what I was saying is a potential interpretation of the H, at least in the Luwian and Hittite Anatolian hieroglyphs, and it's more than a potential interpretation. It's well known there. That means gateway or portal. But could it mean the same thing? Could it symbolize the same thing at Göbekli Tepe? I believe so from the context. Could that tie in with Tiwanaku and Pumapunku also? So are we talking gateway to the sun? Yes, we have what's known as the gateway to the sun, and it has the solar symbolism on it, and I'm convinced that the H in part is a very stylized rendition of some of this solar symbolism. If you look at the little fellow there holding up the staffs, what are known as staffs are, I think, are plasma columns. You know, you could say maybe it's a stretch, but I want to throw it out that these are solar plasma configurations, at least in a stylized form, and talking about the sun. The sun was so central to so many ancient cultures, and I think it was more than just, oh, it's a bright thing in the sky. It was so important both from a spiritual aspect and from a realistic aspect of what the sun can do over time and over the ages. So the ancients knew that we are connected to the sun, I'm convinced, to the stars, to the cosmos in a very literal sense, And we come from and return to the divine. For them, the sun was the divine. The Giza Plateau was literally touched by the sun. It was touched by the divine. That's why I think it was the Giza Plateau for all those millennia, why they ultimately venerated it so much as Rostau, etc. I mean, it was literally touched by the sun. We have the evidence of that. And so we need to rediscover their wisdom. We need to understand the cosmic origins. And I think that ties in with the cosmic summit here. The classic ancients, this is just about my last slide, were correct when they spoke of even more ancient civilizations. Plato, I didn't get into Plato and Atlantis specifically, but when Plato is talking about Atlantis, he's talking about a period that in modern terms is the end of the last ice age. And he's talking about the destruction of Atlantis in a day and a night. Well, that ties in with the modern evidence of what happened at the end of the last ice age, so dramatically, so quickly. So we have this earlier cycle of civilization ending with the last ice age. Ending at the end of the last ice age, we have a dark period, solar-induced dark age, and then the beginning of civilization again. So now, 30 seconds for advertisements. If you'd like to learn more about this, I suggest my book, Forgotten Civilization. Make sure you get the second revised edition, which has a whole new chapter, supplements to all the other chapters, 40 more plus illustrations added to it. Everything in the first edition plus a lot more. If you want to bring this story to the children, and I think we need to start bringing truth and reality and questioning and thinking for themselves to younger people. Katie, my wife, has written a book for children. It's called Adriana and the Ancient Mysteries. It's part of a series. The first book is The Great Sphinx. Some of you who were here last year kindly purchased a copy, and we've got to nothing but great feedback on it. And it's a sophisticated book for children. It's the type of book I wanted to read as a child. It's not 3 words to a page. It's a real book. It's real information. It's real teaching. And that's what I think we all need at every level. I'm still a student. I still want to learn new things every day. So if you're interested in that, we have some copies with us. Just see Katie or myself. I volunteer for Oracle, Organization for the Research of Ancient Culture. You can find out more about this on my website, robertschoch.com. There's the website at the bottom. If you're interested in seeing Easter Island, which is a fabulous place to visit, we're actually putting together a trip to Easter Island over late December, early January, so it'll be for New Year's. And if you're interested in seeing Egypt, there's a wonderful time to see Egypt, and that is in August 2027, because there will be a major total solar eclipse viewable from Luxor in Egypt. Over 6 minutes duration, once in a lifetime experience. None of you will ever be alive. None of you will be alive when there's another solar eclipse like this, and it won't be viewable from Egypt anyway. So that I'm very excited about. I don't get that excited about going to Egypt anymore, but this one I am excited about because, it's literally once in a lifetime to see a total solar eclipse from Luxor. So if you're interested in that, see it. But again, thank you so much. Visit my website for more information, and I really appreciate being here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Masterful as always. Thank you. You guys are okay. I was going to try and jump up there.
Robert Schoch, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah? He never disappoints, I tell you what.
And I just had a clarification. I thought he was coming up to tell me to wind up, but he was just coming up to see me. So I apologize about that.
I always love to listen to him talk, and we've been doing this for now 12 years, You and I, 12 years of trips and listening to your lectures. And actually, I even read his audio book, a couple of them.
That's right. That's
yes,
right.
yes. So
if you listen to the audio book of mine, Forgotten Civilization, and you do Origins of the Sphinx too, or Origins of the Sphinx, the voice you will hear is his voice. I'm so honored to have him do the audio book versions.